Good afternoon and welcome to WorldOregon's 2022 Great Decision Series. Today's webinar on climate change with Brook Thompson. We're looking forward to hearing from this very impressive woman talking about such a crucial issue. Before we dive into today's program, just a few announcements that will be familiar for those of you who've been to one of our webinars and maybe new for some of you. Again, this is a WorldOregon Zoom webinar. It is supported by members and our sponsors. If you're not a member of WorldOregon, I encourage you to join at worldoregon.org. This is a Zoom webinar, which means only staff and our speaker will have their video and audio on. For everyone else, you can post questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. Again, please post your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. In the chat, we will post useful links to this event or to other events. It helps us to better manage the questions when they're in the Q&A function. This talk today will be recorded for posting later on YouTube. If you've missed any of the previous Great Decision talks, they're all up on our YouTube channel as well. Next week concludes the series, and we'll post some information later on that. I want to note that this session, which is on climate change, will be followed by our last of our 3 discussion series with Portland State University grad students. That is on March 3rd at noon, and I will post a link for that in the chat. You can sign up for that. I would also note that our young professionals have a Long Reads Club discussion on Sunday about Singapore. And in the news, other than the Supreme Court nomination that happened today, the other news, of course, that I'm sure you've been seeing a lot of is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have made a statement denouncing Russia's invasion. We have put together a rapid reaction program with an OSU professor on Monday at 2 p.m. We'll post links to all that in the chat. Again, hope you can join us next Monday to hear more about this terrible situation. And now on a happier note, I want to introduce today's speaker. Brook Thompson is with the Yurok and Karuk Native American tribes from Northern California. She's currently a master's student at Stanford University in the Environmental Engineering program. And she's previously graduated from Portland State University's Honor College with a degree in civil engineering and a minor in political science. She has a lot of experience in the Portland metro area, as well as with water rights, Native American knowledge, through engineering, public policy, and social action. It's a special treat to have her today. We will post a link to her webpage shortly in the chat so you can learn more about her. Without further ado, Brook Thompson.
Hi, thank you for that great introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about foreign policy, climate change, and climate justice. So let me just share my slides here. Oh, let me take this away. Yeah, so like he said previously, I have a degree in civil engineering with a minor in political science. Right now, I'm pursuing my master's in environmental engineering at Stanford University, which is where I'm located right now. I have a focus area in water resources and hydrology here. And this photo on the left is a photo from when I was in DC, where I had the opportunity to intern for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Part of my, let's see. Part of my undergrad research was done through Semester at Sea, which was a program that allowed me to travel to all of these different countries you see below. So I pretty much circled the world on a ship. And when I was on the boat, I studied classes in foreign policy, comparative governments, and oceanography. So if you see, I have quite a diversity of classes or places where I studied each of these governments. And one of the reasons I did this program specifically was because it was by ship. So my people are from Northern California. We live around the Humboldt and Donut County areas in the Redwood Forest along the Klamath River. And so we are coastal and river people. And for me, it was important to be able to travel and meet other Indigenous people around the world who also were coastal peoples. So that was just to give a bit of my background, but I wanted to go over a brief history of the United Nations because I feel like that's really important in understanding where we are right now with climate negotiations. And it might be even more relevant right now with what's happening with Russia. But the United Nations first started out as the League of Nations in 1919 with the end of World War I, that should say one, through Woodward Wilson, president of the US at the time. And before this era, I think it's important to note that the United States kind of had an isolation policy. So we purposely decided not to be that involved in other world affairs. And so we were mainly focused on ourselves at that time in our own conflicts, but that all changed with the world wars. And then we had the Second World War. And then around 1945, we created the United Nations and dissolved the League of Nations, or it really transformed it to the United Nations, where initially there was 50 countries that came together. The United Nations now has vastly expanded and has different branches. And one of these is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which created the Conference of Parties, which is known as COP, in 1995. COP, and we just had COP 26 this last year, creates announcements of new innovations, funds, and pledges to reduce CO2 emissions. So it's really a conference that happens once a year to focus on how different nations can come together to reduce climate change. And I was actually invited to attend COP 26 this last year in an Indigenous group, but I was unable to go because of school. So I'm hoping to be there next year to be a part of negotiations. In 1988, the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, was established by the United Nations Environmental Program. And this was important because this is one of the first times we really started to focus on climate change as a world organization. And that IPCC and COP led to the 2015 Paris Agreement, which was adopted by nearly every nation to address climate change and its negative impacts. And also, I think this is just good to keep in mind that the United States is the top contributor of carbon emissions in the world, with China and Russia coming second. And then also keeping in mind with this history that, it was the US president who brought together the League of Nations and thus the UN. And so that history there is important to understand when talking about reinforcing negotiations in the future. Let's see if my clicker's working. Okay. So who is climate change for? And you would think the answer would just flat out be for everyone. And the answer is that it should be for everyone and everyone's affected. But there's a lot of people who've been left out of the environmental movements. So environmental justice is a social movement seeking to achieve the fair and equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens associated with economic production. Protection of environment is done through laws, regulations, and policies internationally. But there is no environmental justice without racial justice. And that's where the intersection comes in here. When taking into account race, national origin, income, ability, gender, and sexual identity, these attributes should not impact the opportunity and treatment of people when it comes to the enforcement of the protection of the environment. And one example I think of here is the Sierra Club. So the Sierra Club is now known as an environmental organization, but in its founding, it was founded by white men who really purposely did not let Black or Native American men into their club, where they'd go exploring different forest areas. And so seeing the history of how previous environmental organizations were founded still impacts who's being looked at for environmental change now, and kind of how the system works and who's left out of the system. And then with this, there's also the United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People. And the photo on the bottom right here is a UN gathering with some groups of the Indigenous people who attend. The basics of the UN Rights of Indigenous People is that it was adopted in 2007, and this is after over 30 years of negotiations. It's not a legally binding contract on countries and in and of itself. The general idea of it is to set the rules for the treatment of and obligations of the state towards Indigenous peoples and individuals. And I believe it was the US and New Zealand to sign on last. There's 4 major countries that are involved in the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. And I think it's interesting that some countries took longer than others to sign on to this, especially since it's not legally binding. But that's maybe a discussion you can have with yourself. I would really recommend looking up this document and skimming through some of the procedures, because it is really interesting what is outlined in it. So to get a general idea of what's covered under it, there's ideas for self-determination, life and security, culture and language, education, economics, land, territories and resources, environmental health, development, self-government, and treaties, and then a few other miscellaneous parts. But for me personally, after I learned about the United Nations rights of Indigenous peoples, I was so enthralled by it, and it made me so happy to see what I saw these really amazing and thought out guidelines about how we should be treated as Indigenous peoples. And I bought this poster on the left-hand side that actually outlines every single article. And trust me, this poster is like half the size of my door when I had it. The text is still small on that, but I used to read it all the time when I woke up in the morning on my door. That was until it recently got taken down after I had an event at Standing Rock. So when I was about 20 years old is when Standing Rock was happening. So I did what any reasonable 20-year-old would do and hopped in a car of people I don't know and drove towards North Dakota in 27 hours to get to Standing Rock, because I didn't own a car myself at the time. And if you don't know what Standing Rock was in the No DAPL campaign, it was a Dakota Access Pipeline that was going through the Missouri River, and it was going through part of the reservation of the Standing Rock tribe in North Dakota. And the tribe and other Indigenous peoples in the area felt like the procedure wasn't done properly, that they shouldn't have changed the pipeline from going towards Bismarck or the areas in North Dakota where it was mainly white populations, for fear of environmental issues with the pipeline. And instead they moved it towards the reservation. And then there was confusion when it came to ancestral artifacts. And also there was issues. The main issue was having a pipeline go through the river itself and what would happen if that pipeline were to break. And so thousands of Indigenous peoples and other allies gathered by the reservation and by the construction site to try to stop this project for the sake of the environment. And so the top photo is me on horseback at Standing Rock with one of my cousins. And the bottom photo is what the camp looked like. And I cannot stress how big this area was. It was like a Native American city, if there ever was a modern one. But as you may know, if you followed the incident, a lot of horrible things happened there. And I was fortunate enough to only be there about a month, so I didn't see a lot of the worst parts that happened there, but I definitely have friends who had first experiences with being shot at, with being sprayed by tear gas and by the water cannons and freezing areas, and by being just treated horribly in general. And then I experienced the issues outside the encampment, where when you try to get gas or groceries or simple things, like people just stare you down and are just mad at you for being Indigenous and being in the area. And it was hard for us because we were there feeling like we're trying to protect everyone in that area too, who even despised us for being there, because we want clean water and the ability to have that river for future generations for everyone in the area, not just us. So after a while, all these news articles started breaking out about UN, and partially based on the Indigenous right, the UN's Declarations of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and just general human rights issues, where UN inspectors came out. They came in the area and pretty much, said there is multiple human rights abuses. But just because they say that doesn't mean anything can really be done about it. I remember a lot of frustration of not having national leaders at the time, which would have been Barack Obama, ignore the issue. And then even, I think when Hillary Clinton was running, she said there was like reasonable people on both sides of the argument for the pipeline, which was not the response we were looking for. And it's just very disheartening when you see people give up a lot of time from schooling. They gave up their houses, a lot of their jobs, and were people who just like left everything like me and came there to fight for what they felt like was right for the environment and for the surrounding area, and to support our fellow tribal members. And this was important to me because I face a lot of issues with the water at home and what's happening to the river on the Klamath River. And so I felt like if I went there to support leadership at Standing Rock, then that sense of community might help us in our water struggles in the future. And that's where I also really got to learn about other nations and other countries' struggles with water, where they came from around the world to help with this issue. And that's one of the reasons it encouraged me to study abroad and do that semester at sea. And so here's some images from Standing Rock if you happen to have not seen them before. It was really, really traumatizing to many people who were there. And it still got built regardless. And I think this instance is important to bring up, not only because it's something I can talk on, since it's something I saw firsthand, but also to recognize that, Indigenous people are really here to fight for the environment and fight for climate, for everyone's prosperity. But also Indigenous peoples are especially vulnerable to climate change. So Indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change. Approximately 370 million people are considered to be Indigenous, which is about 5% of the world's population. Some of the major issues that Indigenous peoples face, and you have to remember these are super vague because it's really specific to a location, but generally deforestation. Indigenous people and local communities manage at least 24% of the world's forests. And also deforestation leads to increased carbon emissions and then less carbon recapture. Biodiversity. Indigenous peoples protect about 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. Sea level rise. There's 27 million Indigenous people in nearly 2,000 communities in 87 countries. There isn't a part of the world where Native coastal people don't live. And that's something I really got to see firsthand on my travels. And for me, hearing some of the struggles of my fellow people, a lot of them felt super similar. And I was surprised at that. Just, I think, because there's not a lot of media around Indigenous people, and we're often, I think, purposely left out of conversations. So it really took me experiencing it firsthand to get that knowledge. But also, I've heard stories of people who live in like the Pacific, for example, and how their ancestral burial grounds are getting buried by the sea level rise, and how a lot of their villages are based on the sea, and how now it's going to cause mass migration from their ancestral homelands because of the sea level rise. And also, just again with the burial ground, for me, like thinking about someone you're visiting, like your family member, like like say your grandmother, you're visiting her at her gravesite for generations, so maybe your great grandmother, and you know where she is and you respect that place, and to see that place you come to have that spiritual connection just be taken away by something that's preventable, like sea level rise, would be really, really tough. And then agriculture, so the loss of food sources and economic support through that food. And I wanted to share this quote, and I believe this photo's her, Miss Rivera, speaking at the United Nations, or IPCC. So she says, "We as Indigenous women and Indigenous people believe it is vital to take into account our knowledge to prevent and adapt to climate change, because the communities are the ones who know how." And then that leading us to some climate solutions. And what gives me hope in a time where a lot of my fellow peers of young people, I feel really hopeless and down about the climate. And a lot of my friends don't even want to have children because they're afraid that it's too irresponsible with the climate issues coming up. And the solutions are mainly focused around traditional ecological knowledge. So the evolving knowledge acquired by Indigenous and local peoples over hundreds of thousands of years through the direct contact with the environments. Tech is an accumulating body of knowledge, practice, and belief evolving by adaptive processes handed down through generations, by cultural transmission, about the relationship of living beings, human and non-human, with one another and with the environment. Encompasses the worldview of Indigenous peoples, which includes ecology, spirituality, human and animal relationships, and more. And this is a quote from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And one thing I'd like to point out is that word bicultural transmissions, because a lot of that was through oral language in many of our tribes. And that's important to me because my grandfather, who's no longer with us, Archie Thompson, he was one of the last language speakers of my language, the Yurok language. And there's so much knowledge that is carried through the language itself. It's a different way, the language carries a different way of thinking completely. And it holds a lot of information about plants and animals just in the words itself, nonetheless the history that was passed down. But that was purposely erased in the boarding school era, where people like my grandfather were torn from his homes and his families, and he was dragged by his legs from under his bed to be forced to go to boarding schools, where they beat the language out of him because it was a US policy then seeing that taking culture away from Indigenous peoples and making us no longer culturally and ethnically native was way cheaper than physically killing us at the time. So knowing he survived that and was still able to pass some of that knowledge down to me and others in the community is really special to me, but also makes me weep at the thought of all the knowledge that was lost in our communities because of practices like that. And then just also thinking about intersections in that timeline from before with the creation of the UN and the world wars is also to keep in mind Adolf Hitler in his book Mein Kampf cited as using US's tactics on removal of Indigenous peoples as part of his inspiration and his regime. And so these events are not disconnected. There's a lot of intersectionality here when it comes to oppressions of people and also environmental degradation and the systems that have come afterwards to try to combat that. So traditional ecological knowledge for me, I break down into two categories. So values and leadership, which includes diversity of inputs. And so I put that image that we saw earlier from environmental justice there of different identity groups like gender, nationality, racial identity, because it is common practice for many tribes when they make leadership decisions and have councils that you have elders and that you have youth and women and men. And so honestly, that is something that we did not found this country on. And a lot of it has been institutionalized to support white men. But there's a lot of benefit that comes from having different perspectives And that's has even been shown in data through workforce that having more diverse workforce improves financial income and productivity. So that's something that, you know, we didn't need the current research for, that we've already known that there's value in diversity of opinions and that coming to the table with leadership. There's conflict resolution, perspective on plants and animals. And so when I say perspective, I mean, for example, my tribe and a few other tribes around the world have legally said that our rivers have personhood, and therefore we can sue on behalf of our rivers. But that also goes hand in hand is that we don't see a lot of our environmental resources just as capital, as ways to make money and means, but that they have their own, you know, spirit, they have their own ability, and that's something we should respect, because we understand we're interconnected with the health of the river, for example, is how we are as people and our health. Negotiations. So when I think about negotiations and conflict resolution, I think about how, for example, the branches of government was based on the Iroquois Confederacy. And so the United States government has actually already based part of how we're structured as a government on Indigenous knowledge and leadership, but that's often not brought up in history classes. So there's still a lot of information out there on how organizations can become and types of leadership styles that can be taken into future climate negotiations. And then seventh generation, just this very simple concept that many Indigenous peoples have, that, you know, when we do an action, when we're making decisions, we should not only consider about how that's going to affect us personally in our communities, but how that's going to affect our generations, 7 generations ahead of us. How will me taking a stance against a certain policy or supporting a certain aspect of living affect my great grandchildren? And I feel like a lot of times when it comes to climate discussions, we don't have that mindset that far out. And definitely if we considered multiple generations ahead of time, you know, decades ago, we wouldn't be facing the current issues we are now. And then there's the management practices and science side, which includes the relationships between plants, animals, natural phenomenon, landscapes, and timing of events that are used for lifeways, such as hunting, fishing, trapping, agriculture, and forestry. And so one example of that is controlled burns. That's something my tribe did traditionally and has only recently been picked up in the US and California again. And that's only because, right, climate change creates more larger fires in the area, but then also trying to keep the wilderness, quote unquote, like pristine and keeping Indigenous peoples off of the land and managing it caused more wildfires over the last 100 years, because initially we were doing burns all the time to help control that. And when the lower brush was burned yearly, less larger fires would come up because there wasn't as much accumulation of fire material. And so keeping Indigenous peoples off the land created larger forest fires in the long run. But then also we're experiencing more forest fires because of climate change too. And so there's a lot of solutions that are already available to us through Indigenous knowledge. It's just legislation and leaders needing to ask for that knowledge and really respecting us as people and not just taking from us. But not only that, is we should have more Indigenous people within leadership itself, nationally and internationally as well. And one example where that can be done is the United Nations. And so this is another quote from an Indigenous activist, where the Indigenous culture teaches us to respect rivers, lakes, plants, animals, and spiritual beings who live in these places. You can't solve the climate crisis without including Indigenous peoples and without protecting their territories. So I feel like Eli's quote really sums up what I'm trying to say here, is that we do have solutions to climate change, and it will really require more Indigenous leadership on our part internationally. But a lot of these structures that were built and a lot of the government structures we work in have very few Indigenous people in them. And so it's going to take a whole institutional restructuring of not only our government, but governments around the world, in addition to the UN, because the UN only has so much power to say you should do something without it being backed up with actual force. Because in reality, no one's going to say, US, you did this wrong to Indigenous people, or you're not taking proper leadership with these climate issues, even though there is pressure. But it's very unlikely we're going to get completely cut by the UN, especially because we are such a big contributor to CO2 emissions. And so it really takes that internal work in addition to the external work for these foreign policies around climate to make a big difference. So that's the majority of my speech. I mean, if people have questions, I also have extra slides I can show if people are interested in some environmental issues I've seen personally within my tribe. But other than that, here's me and some of my regalia from upriver on the Klamath River, and my Instagram handle that we can also put in the chat. But thank you everyone so much. And we'll now be moving to question and answers.
Great, thank you so much, Brooke. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs here at WorldOregon. If people are interested, it would maybe be wonderful too if you could, perhaps after the program, email me your PowerPoint. Sometimes people ask for that. So just jumping right in, one of our first questions comes from somebody in the audience, and it's really a question about war, and war being a significant contributor to climate change. And I'm wondering, when you think about climate activism, do you see an opportunity to connect climate activism more with the anti-war movement and peace building? Because we all know that the destruction of buildings and everything that comes with war releases an awful lot of not just human suffering, but environmental suffering.
Yeah, so I see kind of war and climate change as a feedback loop, in the sense that, right, like you express, a lot of the repercussions of war have environmental issues that come with it, and the destruction. And one of the things that I think about with that is, DEET in the US, and part of the chemical used in like Agent Orange in Vietnam and development at that same time. So in the Vietnam War, they used Agent Orange, which is I don't even know if I have the words for it. It's just completely terrifying and horrible. And I saw so many photos when I was in Vietnam of the repercussions of that. But part of that same chemical was used in, I forget if it was a fire suppressant or if it was just used for agriculture, but a pesticide that was used in my area in Northern California and was sprayed all around before they realized how toxic it was and not worth using. And there's lasting impact from that, where a lot of our basket materials use plant materials that we put in our mouths to process, but the chemical still lives in the environment and hasn't completely degraded yet. And so a lot of people have gotten mouth cancers and diseases from using that material in the West Coast area, who are basket weavers. The other thing with that too is that there can be wars created based on climate issues. That hasn't really been something we've seen yet, but stresses when it comes to resources means that there's a possibility, especially around water. And for example, like having less freshwater reserves, and it's less of an issue in the US where we're such a large territory and we have a lot of our own rivers, but places where groundwater and rivers and headwaters crosses borders in close areas with dams, and who's seeking at what amount of water when, and who's being truthful about it. So climate change has a potential for war, and then war also leads to more climate change. So I guess that's my answer to that. I do think they contribute to each other. And of course, if you're in a war, no one's thinking about, their CO2 emissions as much. It's not the focus.
So with the new administration, we saw the appointment of Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior. And I'm wondering, is there a sense that Indigenous issues will figure more strongly in policy and negotiations around environmental regulations and climate justice?
Let me think about, I might have a slide to answer this. So, oh my gosh, where is it? Give me one moment. Let me share my screen again. So this is about infrastructure. This slide I made for a different lecture is about infrastructure specifically, but I think it might be helpful. So when coming to change around environmental policy or just justice for Indigenous peoples, having Deb Haaland in there is a really big step. And the fact that we have 2 Native women in Congress for the first time ever is a huge step and very exciting, but still not enough. And it's definitely come way too late. Like I was surprised that those are the first 2 Indigenous women in Congress after all this time. But right, decision making comes in the US comes from different places where it's a lot of voters and elected officials, right? The voters elect the elected officials, and then taxes and ballot measures go to policy and funding that can be created by elected officials through the federal, state, and local city government. So it not only takes changing, right, who the person in charge is on the federal level, such as Deb Haaland, but it also takes voters being in line with her stances too, and other elected officials. Because if it's just her having an opinion and that background and understanding of what needs to be done, but she doesn't have the support, which is good for some part of it because it's the checks and balances that help keep things equitable, then she still can't get much done. But it is very exciting to have someone who just even understands what it is to grow up as an Indigenous person and to have that background finally being put in charge about policies and procedures that literally affect our everyday lives as Indigenous peoples and for the environment in general.
So, it seems like climate change proposals and solutions, things like net zero targets and carbon offset markets, often discount or ignore the voices of those who stand to bear the brunt of climate impacts, like Indigenous communities. And do you see the focus at COP26 on Indigenous activism changing that at all?
I want to say yes, because I want to believe in the United Nations and COP. I think there's a difference between speaking and being heard. So we can have Indigenous people at COP and we can have them speaking about issues that are important to us or that we think will make real big impacts. But we also need the different nations to understand that and make those hard changes. And I feel like a lot of times that we're just underheard, and the fact that a lot of people don't even have the basic understanding of Indigenous people's histories to have these conversations takes up a lot of the time that we should be spending on like the fine details. Because I've met many educated people in college who don't even know that Native Americans are still alive in America. Nonetheless, like how we're a sovereign nation within the nation of the United States, how we have this traditional ecological knowledge, because I meet a lot of people and people in high up places who believe that, Indigenous people's understanding of the world is primitive and therefore useless to current conversations. And that comes from a history of having us seen pretty much as being stupid and really bluntly in US history and through media as a way to justify colonization of our lands and of our bodies. And one way you see this is through what they call like Indian speak in movies. So if anyone's seen like old Westerns, how, the person speaks in like broken language and they speak very deeply and very slowly. And they kind of speak in broken English. That was done to actually kind of have Indigenous people seen as foreign entities, because you'll see that with people who come to like the US too, where they're speaking kind of broken English And that was done very purposely to make Indigenous people seem foreign. And actually, if people take implicit bias tests about Indigenous people from the Harvard implicit bias test online, vast majority of people implicitly believe that Indigenous people are foreign and white people are native to the United States. And so, again, like, people having that basic misunderstanding about us and biases towards Indigenous people make having larger conversations so hard, and especially when it comes to climate change and what's a lot of times where the fuss is around new technology. It seems like people are very reluctant to listen to us and maybe go back to old ways and old technologies and understandings of the world. And yet we've proven that to work for us for thousands of years with no issue. But yeah, it's very challenging for me, because I definitely think if we had more Indigenous people in different policy positions around the world, then they'd have an easier time listening to other Indigenous peoples as well, to make those real changes. Because I just want to say, like, many politicians, I don't think have the framework to even understand what we're saying a lot of the time, or even want to, even if we're invited to these conferences.
So let me ask you, do you feel that there is a disconnect between how the public perceives protests around pipelines like Standing Rock and more mainstream climate activism as represented by somebody like a Greta Thunberg? And how can we connect those dots better, that they are really about the same conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I have to think about that a bit. I guess my first thing I'd say is, even in that word protest is a bit biased, right? Because we, like Standing Rock and a lot of these other, things that are seen as protests by the outside, we call protections, because we're not necessarily trying to protest anything in particular. We're just trying to protect the land and the places we're on. And so we've tried to reframe the word protest around what we do. But I don't know, that's interesting. Like, they are the same conversation. I think that's just kind of like a media thing, honestly, and the media getting hyped up about one particular person, which, I mean, she is a great person and very inspirational. But, then I've had friends at the UN who, after talking about climate issues and Indigenous rights and Indigenous understanding of how to solve some of these climate issues, the news reporters only ask him about Greta and what he thinks about her and like her stances. And so they are part of the same solution. I mean, they're just different parts of the same conversation. And I think the issue is that there's not much media coverage and not much historical context around Indigenous peoples as there should be. Yeah, I don't know if that actually answered the question.
No, and I so appreciate you framing the difference between protection and protest. I think that's a really great way for us to realize that even the word protest has some bias attached to it. So I think that was a great answer. I'm curious, how have Indigenous activists in the U.S. And maybe you don't know the entire history of it. I don't know, but how Indigenous activists in the U.S., how are they engaging with movements like I Don't Know More in Canada, or activists from the Pacific Islands? And do you think there is, or there could be, a better sense of, sort of quote unquote multilateral collaboration on climate justice between these groups?
Oh man, I think that's probably the hardest question I've ever been asked, just because Indigenous climate activists are so diverse. I mean, so like, some of us stand on like completely other sides of like fields of methods of thinking of how climate change should come about, or how solutions to climate change should come about. But at the end of the day, we just want the best for the environment and for our peoples. But I don't think there's an answer to that one, just because the groups that I've known and been a part of and talked to just vary so greatly. Yeah, I think that's an impossible question. I'm sorry, it's not very.
No, that's great. I mean, it is great decisions, and the great decisions bring with it hard questions. So, so you talked a lot about traditional ecological knowledge, And I'm wondering, because you're from an area in California, and it's very similar to what we deal with here around forest fires. And I'm wondering if you could speak more about how traditional ecological knowledge practices have helped forest fire management, and is there something we could be doing to tailor that to the wildfires in Oregon better?
Yeah. Firstly, I want to go back to the previous question. I thought that you mentioned that there's the Native American organizations and activists, but I also want to point out that the Indigenous government should really be in that conversation too, because at least they're a tiny bit more united as like coherent of what they want to get done. And they're definitely should be just in the as much as in the conversation about climate change as any of these organizations or any of these other nations. But then with this question about fire mitigation, I mean, if you want a way better explanation of some of the benefits of Indigenous fire management, I have a recording from an elder in my tribe who's super knowledgeable on this on my website, and I'll link that down here in the chat. So I would recommend listening to that, but also I do think it can be adapted in Oregon. I honestly don't see why it hasn't been yet, because there should be cultural fire management in Oregon too, unless it's the people are less well organized who brought it here in California. I mean, even here it's still slightly controversial. And for me, it actually kind of got frustrated when I came to Stanford, because when I was touring the schools, there's actually a poster downstairs in the engineering building about burning as a way of forest fire management and mitigation. And I read the poster, and nowhere in it did I see mention of Indigenous peoples as being the founders of this method. And it was kind of shown as like this new technique, which frustrates me because that's something that happens quite often is right. There's tools that are used in society that we're never accredited for. And we, I guess, privilege is coming that we discovered or we were the founders of some type of beneficial aspect to, everyday culture. But so there might be some of that going on where there is types of mitigation in Oregon, but it's just not being accredited. And also, again, it might just be a policymakers, right? Because Oregon's a very Republican state, except for like our two central hubs of like population, which is Democratic and overrules most of the other policy. But at like local government levels in Oregon, it's not very, I guess, nuanced. And then also, I've seen a lot of Indigenous racism in Oregon, and like rural areas too. So it might be a combination of that, and then just the fact that it hasn't been practiced by government organizations that long. And so government organizations are notoriously slow at, getting actual work done at times. And so it might also be that, but I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see more cultural management of fires in Oregon in the next, 20 years or so.
Well, another question that comes up as we talk about Oregon, and of course, we're always concerned about the world, but the world starts here. That's certainly one of the greatest environmental catastrophes affecting Indigenous peoples is the destruction of the Columbia Snake River systems. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the status of taking down dams in that system and how that may impact Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, give me just one more minute. I have another slide on this. I give a lot of the issues I talk about regularly are on racism within water infrastructure. And so that's very relevant to what that's about. But let me see if I can find it. And then can you just restate the question a bit? Is it about, do you want to know about dams or about those rivers in particular?
Well, I think we're talking about both the damage of taking down the dams, but also that river system in particular.
Yeah, let me share my screen. So I'm less knowledgeable on that particular river system, but where is it? So I'm from this area in Northern California along the Klamath River, and we are having 3 of the 5 dams on the Klamath River being taken down. And I'm from a fishing community where we live our whole life along the Klamath River. I mean, the word Yurok, my tribe, literally translates to downriver people. My name Brook is spelled without an E, so as in like a small stream. And we have seen a fish kill from too much water being taken out in Oregon, actually, because the Klamath River's headwaters in Oregon. And so agriculture and poor legislation that happened in Oregon led to the fish kill in my area, where when I was 7 years old, after coming back from a ceremony, walked along the river shores with my parents and saw dead fish laying stacked on each shoreline. And that incident has impacted us ever since then. You know, as an Indigenous person, like the mindset of Indigenous health comes from not only physical health, which is mainly the focus in Western culture, but mental health, spiritual well-being, and community well-being. And if any one of those are in danger or not great, then the rest of that suffers too. And so with that, for example, with like the dams and the issues that's caused with our salmon population, and also like water being taken out from our river from the tributaries that gets sent to other places in California because their water management's poor and because of droughts, leads to us not being able to touch the water much of the time in the summer because of blue-green algae blooms that can be carcinogenic. And also, like, I've seen people get like weird skin rashes and disease from touching the water, even though this is like where we spend our whole life, and it's our mode of transportation too. All our villages are along the river. We use boats to get from village to village instead of roads because the roads are really mountainous and really dangerous. I've had multiple cousins die on mountain roads. And it's just like our whole life is surrounded around this river. And if we don't have our fish, we don't get the exercise from fishing. We're in a food desert when we don't have the fish. And so we have to eat commodity food or like poor food that's cheap and lasts a long time because it takes so long to drive. Like if the North Road is closed off, it takes pretty much a whole day to go down south to Arcata, go shopping, and then come back. And that is if you have a car, plus the gas it takes to get there. And like the poor food that comes from like, you know, eating dollar hot dogs and top ramen versus nutritious salmon like every single day greatly affects our physical well-being, which leads to us literally dying from high rates of diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, but also leads less time with family because we don't have that economic income. So we have to travel other places to get jobs. And that leads to poor spiritual and mental health when we can't be around our families, we're not getting the exercise, and instead we have to work jobs in far off places, which are usually manual labor jobs because not many Indigenous peoples have higher education compared to our population. And then it just tears apart our entire like life and culture because then also like we can't have our ceremonies. A lot of our ceremonies involve salmon as like a main staple, and it kind of just tears apart of who we are as Indigenous people and our livelihood and all our well-being when we don't have the salmon because of these dams on the river. And then you've also seen areas where, you know, Indigenous people have understood the importance of dams such as Celilo Falls, which was, you know, dammed up during World War II, coming back to World War II again, for navigation for barges in the area. And the people of Celilo were promised this river and promised their traditional fishing grounds. And it just got taken away like that, and the dam was put in. But one of the issues with that too is that, you know, the federal government gave them $26.8 million for the losses, but that does not account for any of the costs that's costing people in the current day, and is such a fraction of what it means to us to have those fishing grounds and to have that area for our community, which kind of gives like the unstableness of nation to nation relationships within the US with Indigenous peoples and the federal government too. on how that was promised to those people and yet taken away, and the pain that still causes those people. Because people who were like in that photograph right there, like still alive, that didn't happen that long ago. Yeah, so I started rambling a bit, but it's the quality of the rivers and the infrastructure that's put on there has life or death impacts on Indigenous peoples. And sometimes it's hard to see that when we're living in cities or we're removed from the situation or don't have that connection to the land. But it really does make a big impact on how we live and who we become as Indigenous people.
So as countries are recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm curious, what are some other ways that Indigenous knowledge, like say farming practice, might contribute to more nature-based solutions against climate change and in terms of aiding economic recovery?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because I feel like some of these issues too would be less of an issues if they were adopted way back when. I mean, for example, right, with like the Dust Bowl, like the Dust Bowl was caused by mismanagement of the land in the United States and caused that huge economic depression. But a lot of that could have been prevented by more sustainable farming practices that Indigenous people knew of at the time. And I'm not an expert in agriculture specifically. I also have a page interviewed from a person who works on agriculture and is college educated from the Cherokee Nation, and I just put the link in the bio with my interview with her surrounding tech. But one is like the Three Sisters methods. For example, right, there's beans, corn, and squash. The squash protects the plants from pests and things that are trying to eat it. The beans use the corn to crawl up and uses that the stalk. And then not only do the three grow really well together, and some take nitrogen and some are nitrogen fixing, so they are in a cycle with the soil, but also each of those is kind of what people need in their bodies to live a healthy life. Like the balance of vitamins, protein, and nutrients within those three plants work so well together. And so they're kind of a perfect combination where you're not destroying the soil, they're keeping each other protected and benefiting each other in how they grow, but also how they benefit our bodies when we eat it is one example I can think of. But there's so many, and it's so region specific, it's hard to say. But you compared that to versus like, right, we have these drought issues and these issues with water taken away because of the droughts, but then still priority being given to people like in certain agricultural fields, such as like almonds, where it takes something crazy like a gallon to grow like one almond. And and we're spending time and money and resources on, for example, growing almonds that we're exporting other places when it's literally, killing people like in my tribe from taking away our resources. And like I said, like death from cardiovascular disease and even suicide. We declared a public emergency a few years ago, a state of emergency for the amount of suicide rates we had in my tribe. And part of that's linked to loss of culture, which is linked to loss of, our salmon, on poor degradation of our rivers. But, it blows my mind that we can spend so much time on like things like almond farming and so much resources because of us seeing the economic income from that in California, which is something that can't be ignored. But we have better practices out there. I honestly don't know if it's economically sufficient. I think it will be more so when we have to deal with the cost of environmental problems down the line. But that's kind of the fight of it, is like who's making money where and for what reasons, and what policy has been put in place previously so those people can continue to make money. And it might not be viable. It's not economically viable for me. So I guess as if you're looking at micro or macro economics in the area is my cheat answer.
So Indigenous peoples make up only around 5% of the world's population, but they occupy around 20% of its land, including vast swaths of tropical rainforest. Yet what we see historically is they're receiving less than 1% of all international aid targeted at climate change. I'm wondering, and this is a two-part question, how can non-Indigenous communities give louder voice to this imbalance and injustice? And where do you draw your hope and drive to continue doing what you're doing in the face of something so big?
Yeah, thank you for that. I feel like it's probably good kind of like getting to a wrap up question, but so I have this slide from a different lecture too, and kind of about what people can do on a personal level. So understanding Native mindsets and understandings are different, and that we are diverse people. So that what you learn about one Indigenous group is not going to be true for another, and that there's so much diversity in Indigenous understanding around the world. And I just say that because I did a survey at Portland State one year, and it was a small survey, but it was about around people my age who were like, I think sophomores at the time, on what they thought about Indigenous peoples and just standard questions. But one was how many tribes they thought were in the US, and the average answer was 3. When there's like over 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States, not including, state recognized tribes. So the fact that they knew me as their, like that I was an Indigenous person on campus from a tribe that's not spoken about a lot, but yet people probably just group me in with the other 3 tribes that they only think exist in the US was problematic. So do research of the Indigenous history in your area. So some books I recommend is An Indigenous Peoples History of the US, Custer Died for Your Sins, The Other Slavery, and American Genocide, the United States. This is more to California, but the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, but also relevant to Oregon too. Understanding what's happened at Celilo Falls. There's like Portland, Oregon has the 9th largest Indigenous or urban Indigenous population or Native population. And so knowing that they're around, I mean, Portland State has a bunch of events that you can go to as well, just to get a little bit better understanding and meet people in your community. But yeah, it's important to know whose land you're on. Yeah, and then I also include a link where you can go to, and you guys can provide this too afterwards when I send the slides, that will help you find out whose ancestral territory you're on currently. And that can help you with your research to not use incorrect language in the workplace, like bottom of the totem pole, Indian giver, powwow, off the res, how much Indian are you? And that goes along with just basically treating Indigenous people in the day-to-day you do interact with respect. And then when it comes to policy, or if people here are on committees, whatever level it is, if you're in groups, even if you go out to dinner with a group of friends, look around your table, think about who's included, who's not in your conversations, and why not, and maybe who should be there. And then again, when it comes to legislation, try to support Indigenous legislators when you can. I mean, as long as they're sensible, but there just needs to be a need. I mean, again, when I showed that chart of how policy gets passed with infrastructure, which applies to a lot of things in general, with how things get passed, I know it doesn't feel like as voters we get a lot of right, but organizing as voters, joining organizations that support Indigenous peoples and policies is going to be important for having that systematic change and showing current legislators that you care about Indigenous issues, even if you yourself aren't Indigenous.
Great. Well, Brooke, we are up to our closing time. I want to thank you for just an unbelievably rich and just, great perspective on a topic that I think, certainly Oregonians don't need to be generally convinced that climate change is real, but I think looking at it from a different angle and some different nuance and understanding climate justice in a different frame is absolutely essential. So I want to thank you for being with us today.
Oh yeah, and one last thing, I didn't answer the question about hope. I'll make it simple and sweet. My hope comes from, people who are showing up to speaks like this, and just knowing that there's the knowledge out there to solve a lot of these climate change issues. We as a people just need to make that change, even if it's going to be a hard change for many of us. But the fact that there are solutions, the fact that, I have little cousins that need looking out for, and that me as an Indigenous person whose family faced genocide and all these horrific events that really tried to kill us as a people, and yet we survived and stayed resilient, gives me the hope that I will be able to do that for other generations and people as well. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I want to bring Derek back on to take us out into the day. And this will be on YouTube, as Derek mentioned. And thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Brooke. It's been wonderful to have you here. Just a really incredible perspective. And I'd like to thank the audience for the fantastic questions. Take a look at the chat. I posted World Oregon's diversity, equity, inclusion statement. And we are working as an organization on key issues along those lines. And I think you might find that statement of interest, audience, if you haven't seen it before. Also posted our upcoming events. There's another opportunity to discuss this more next week, March 3rd, when we have the discussion group with Portland State University grad students on this very topic. Brooke, thanks so much for your expertise and your personal experiences and sharing it with us. We look forward to working with you again. Audience, thanks for joining us.